Hi, I'm Ted Morrissey. This is a video for my experimental writing course in the Lindenwood University MFA in Writing program. And we're about halfway through the course, and we've been talking about a lot of interesting issues, including what does it even mean to say something is experimental. But I've maintained that there's a place for experimental work, that it is not just some sort of highly specialized kind of writing that is destined for maybe a handful of people to read it somewhere online or something, and that's that. Rather, it can be widely accepted. It can have a lot of appreciation among a lot of variety of readers and editors and publishers and so forth. And so I thought, well, is that true? I mean, I think it's true. It's kind of been a sense of mine all along. But I thought maybe I'll do a little experiment. So I always have subscribed to literary journals. Nowadays, when you submit to a journal, like via Submittable, for instance, there's an option where you can buy a copy or buy a subscription to the journal. And I almost always do. But that's just something I've always done, even before Submittable, because I feel like, I'm kind of morally obliged to support the kinds of journals that I, want to publish in. Not to mention, I just think it's a really good thing for our culture to have, journals that are publishing the best, most interesting, most innovative kind of writing. And quite frankly, they aren't money makers, and nearly all of them. They're difficult to publish, financially. So just to kind of help keep the lights on, buying a subscription or at least a kind of standalone copy every now and then is a good idea, I think. And as a consequence, I get lots of literary journals, and I don't read them cover to cover, but when they come in, I take a look at them. I find a piece or two or three that looks interesting. I really like craft essays. I like interviews in particular, so I do tend to read those pretty thoroughly. But anyway, I've got a big stack of them in my office. I guess that's what it is, kind of multi-purpose room. But I thought, I'll just go grab a stack practically at random, and I'll just kind of thumb through them for a few minutes and just kind of pick out some pieces that are definitely experimental in the sense of the writers are playing with form, they're playing with language, etc. Right? So I'm just going to kind of go through and show you just from some very, very recent literary journals what is being published out there, how they're kind of playing with language, etc. All right. So again, pretty much at random here. This was a journal that I had lying about. This is from Nimrod, in the Nimrod International Journal, which is a venerable, well-regarded, well-respected kind of journal. And this is their Special Awards 44 issue. So these are all award-winning pieces somehow or another. And gosh, what year? Does it say what year? Yeah, this is fall-winter 2022. So again, very, 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 very recent. So this caught my eye. This is it's a poem, I guess, and I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes here, by Janae J. Bauer. I apologize if I am mispronouncing any of those. I think I got the J right, J period. But this won an honorable mention in Nimrod's Pablo Neruda Prize for Poetry. So yeah, it's a poem. And actually there are several poems that are all related. And it's titled Andrew Wyeth's Footnotes to Self-Portrait 1938. I'll just kind of show you what it looks like on the page there. And there's, the other poem facing it is a similar kind of thing. But it's just a series of footnotes, I suppose generated by that particular painting and numbered as footnotes are numbered. But yet, as you read through them, it's obviously ideas, at least I think it's obvious, ideas that the poet had generated by looking at that piece, which are in some ways about the piece, but oftentimes not about the piece directly. So, like, for example, footnote number 1 for this 1938 self-portrait Part amnesiac, part prophet. Then new line, adjust the light source. New line, crisp the edges. New line, a face before and after is not the moment's face. Footnote number 2, recording my process isn't necessary, yet here I'll record my process. And then it kind of goes on from there. But there are several of these poems, which are all footnotes to various Andrew Wyeth's paintings, right? Andrew Wyeth paintings. So that's an interesting idea. And looking at the contributor's note, this poet is particularly interested in ekphrastic poetry, which, of course, is poetry that describes artwork of some sort. And so very, very interesting, very engaging, very provocative, both kind of to the eye. So it kind of draws you in just as an interesting painting will. Etc. But that won the honorable mention in the Pablo Neruda Poetry Contest. Another piece that stood out to me is this is the honorable mention in the Catherine Ann Porter Prize for Fiction, and this is James Janko's The Wire Walker, and it has a sort of subtitle of sorts or something. It says the Balata refugee camp, Nablus, Palestine. So it's where presumably this piece, was inspired, etc. And notice that the first section is numbered and it has a little subtitle, Stillness. And as you go through this piece, which is otherwise pretty traditional in terms of the way it's set up, you can see that each section is numbered and has, again, a little subtitle. And it's something we don't normally do with fiction, right? We don't normally, maybe we number the sections or at least separate them somehow. We don't always give them subtitles, but sometimes authors do. So again, it's not wildly experimental, but it's a little bit different, right? It's a little bit different. So I wanted to share that piece with you. What else here? It's been a while since I looked through these earlier today, so I don't remember exactly what I've marked here, but let's see. Okay. So this is New Ohio Review, issue number 30, which is winter 2022. Again, very, very recent. And this is a poem by Tracy Knapp. It's called A Working List. And as you can see there, it looks kind of like an erasure sort of thing, where it's this list of kind of notes to self kind of thing. Some of them are crossed out, some of them are not. But of course, you can read the ones that are crossed out quite easily. So it's not erasure really, but part of the reading experience is sort of, why is this one crossed out? Why is this one not crossed out? And kind of reading literally sort of between the lines in terms of that. But again, not wildly experimental, but yet definitely playing with form, playing with language, playing with sort of just the visual appeal on the page, and that kind of thing. So New Ohio Review, A Working List by Tracy Knapp. As long as I'm at it, here's another New Ohio Review. This is a more recent issue even, number 31. And this is fall 2022. And got a couple pieces marked in here. Let's see what I marked. Oh, okay. This is interesting. This is a nonfiction piece. I know several of you are nonfiction people. I'm not really a nonfiction writer myself. I write critical articles that are nonfiction, but that's not the same as creative nonfiction, of course. But this is a piece by Amy Lee Scott, and this is the winner of the Editor's Prize in Nonfiction, selected by Eric LeMay. But again, the author is Amy Lee Scott, and the title of this piece is How Do You Name a Hurricane? And it's very interesting because it's a combination of very short little pieces which the author has herself illustrated with little drawings. Well, they're published a little. I don't know how big they were to begin with, but they're throughout here, right? So not every single item is illustrated, but there's a lot of illustrations, and so that that gives it a different sort of look, because and feel because of the fact that she's provided her own illustrations, but also, as you can see, kind of playing with form in terms of these little vignettes, and also the fact that, like in this case, we've got A, B, C, these kind of list here thing going on, and then I thought it was an interesting touch at the end of the essay. She ends by saying, since I wrote this essay in 2021, anti-Asian American hate crimes have only escalated. I haven't found the words to process the senseless murders of Michelle Go and Christina Yuna Lee. I look at their beautiful faces and mourn. In them, I see my sister, my daughter, and myself. And then she has done little portraits of these two young ladies who were killed in hate crime incidents. And so, dedicating something to another is obviously not unusual, but the way she has done it here is a little unusual and very touching, and a very emotional way to end this piece. So again, very, very interesting at work there, combining graphic imagery with kind of shorter paragraphs and so on. Here is also a poem by Tina Mazel Brazil. And again, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing Tina's name. The title is Poetry as a Lakeside Trailer Park. Not at a lakeside trailer park, but poetry as a lakeside trailer park. And at first glance, it doesn't really look like poetry per se. It's written in sentence and paragraph form. It's got a number of sections which are numbered. But as you go through, you read these bits that are inspired by this particular location, and so on. And so anyway, definitely, starting to sort of edge into that gray area between prose and poetry, playing with structure on the page and that kind of thing. So, again, most of the pieces in New Ohio Review tend to be more traditional, but obviously the editors are open to playing with language, playing with form, etc. Right? So there's another example. This is a venerable journal, Bennington Review, and this is issue 10, which is it's themed Return to a Meadow, and this is spring 2022, so very recent. And I marked this. So this is by an author named Josh English, Pastoral with Waiting Room. And it's, again, whoops, sorry. Try to get that on the screen properly. It's, again, a poem, but it's taking, more or less the look of prose. But if you notice, the sentences, I'll call them that, I guess, long lines of poetry in some cases. But anyway, they don't begin with capital letters and they don't end with punctuation marks. So again, kind of at a glance, it looks more like a prose piece, but playing with, typical kind of rules and regs when it comes to writing prose. But again, it's a poem, according to the author. And again, just in addition to just these sort of very brief little pieces, they are very light on punctuation. Some of the lines do use some punctuation internally. I see some commas, colon, but generally speaking, there's not much there. And like I said, there's no end punctuation, and they don't begin with capital letters. So again, not wildly experimental, but playing a bit with punctuation and capitalization rules and so on. Same issue of the Bennington Review. This is a selection of erasures and collages by Mary I apologize to Mary, but we're familiar with the concepts of erasure and collage. And we looked at a few of them in our anthology, etc. I know some of you shared some of your own on the discussion board, which was terrific. But still something, we're just very much interested in, literarily speaking. So some more erasures and so forth. And there are several in this collection here. Here's more collage. Not wild sort of collage. I mean, I think sometimes we think of collage as being sort of surreal and very frenetic, but these are much less so in terms of movement, in terms of the number of elements, but yet collage still the same. Here we just have a picture of a duck. Right. So anyway, those caught the attention of the editors at the Bennington Review. And there they are. This one is interesting. This is again, more of a kind of a poem, I guess, by Joseph Grantham called Waste Bends. And again, not wildly experimental, but playing with form. We have some lines that are flush left. We have others that are indented, which gives it kind of a hanging indentation look. In fact, when I first kind of glanced at it, I thought, oh, well, they're using hanging indentation, or the author's using hanging indentation. But that's not exactly what's going on here. It's just that some lines are indented and some aren't. So again, not, incredibly, experimental, but yet playing with normal conventions, experimenting with normal conventions, and seeing what one can come up with. All right. So that's the Bennington Review. Just a couple more examples here. This is from Boulevard, numbers 110 and 111. So just very recently received, summer 2022 again. So just hot off the presses, so to speak. And this is what caught my eye. And generally speaking, these are pretty traditional pieces. We do have, some work by K.B. Merritt, which uses some diagrams. So that's interesting. But this is the piece I really wanted to call your attention to. This is a nonfiction piece. Facing My Assailants is the title of the piece by Marianne Abel Lipschitz. Right? And for the most part, pretty traditional in terms of, sentences and paragraphs and that kind of thing. But the thing is, it's an essay about ostensibly taking a sort of self-defense course for women. And what the author has done is taken some of the teachings, find your strength, face your fear, and use those as subheadings. And then each section kind of plays off that instruction, and so on. And so then, over here, we run into relax, let yourself be taken down. Sorry, not very good at this part, right? And again, it's kind of about that specifically, but yet then the author kind of, lets her intellect run a bit. Then we have face the assailant. Who are we to those who want to hurt us? Again, ideas that were taken from the course directly, one assumes, and then she's using that as kind of fodder for her creativity to continue to write this creative nonfiction. So again, not wildly experimental, but taking little bits and pieces, kind of found items. We've talked about found poetry and that kind of thing in this course already, but taking bits of instruction directly from the course, maybe a course manual or a handout or just something the instructor has said, I'm not really sure, but using those bits of found instruction as subheadings, which then sort of organize the essay, but also are kind of jumping off points for different lines of thought and so on. Right? So also very interesting. The one I want to end with here is a really, really interesting journal. It's Sand, Literature and Art, and it's actually based in Berlin, but it's an English language journal. It has a lot of translation, especially from German, which makes sense, but from other languages as well. But here's what's interesting about Sand, in terms of the context that we're talking about, is that the journal itself is experimental. And what I mean by that is that the editors and the design person have tried to not produce a sort of typical, black print on white page kind of journal. So a lot of color, in terms of reproductions, but also just in terms of the layout and design, very different sort of looking things. So taking in some cases, which are pretty traditional poems and stories and so on, but then putting them in the context of an experimentally, playfully designed journal, right? So that's kind of the reverse, right? So rather than a sort of traditional journal that's publishing the occasional, more playful kind of work, you've got a journal which is itself experimental and playful and sort of groundbreaking, which is publishing, in some cases, fairly traditional kind of stuff. I mean, just as an example, this is The Fun Car. That's just a short story by Gurmit Singh. But even just a traditional short story is published in sort of an unusual way, right? With a different color type, kind of obviously set within these boxed, sections on the page, and just kind of goes on like that. So again, it's not that the story itself is experimental, and as you can see, pretty straightforward, just typical indentions of paragraphs, sentences in paragraph forms, some space break there between sections. So that's all pretty typical, pretty traditional. But the way that the editors and the designer have presented it gives it more of an experimental feel, right? So I just want to kind of share Sand, partly because it's really cool, but also because, again, it's sort of taking the opposite approach of, instead of the presentation being traditional and yet presenting some experimental work, the presentation itself is experimental, and in some cases using, giving us some pretty traditional kinds of narrative and so forth. Right. So that's kind of what I wanted to share here. Again, very much at random. So I didn't spend hours and hours combing through books, looking for examples of experimental writing. I literally just walked into my room where I have a big stack of these things and grabbed, the ones on top. And I did grab two or three that, looking through them, I really didn't find anything that I thought was, particularly in line with this discussion. But again, just this is obviously very small sampling, so one can't draw any hard and fast conclusions. But I would definitely say, given the recentness of these publications, that experimental writing, playing with form, playing with language, playing with typeface, playing with images, is still very much alive and well, and editors today are still very much, inclined to take a serious look at it and oftentimes publish it. So there's that. The other, conclusions that one could draw, again, very, kind of tentative conclusions given the small sampling. But I don't know if you noticed, but a few of the pieces that I read were either winners or like honorable mentions in some very prestigious literary contests. And I'm sure they got thousands of entries. I mean, these things, the judges just get overwhelmed with entries. But yet, the work that caught the judge's attention, and either to win the prize or at least to be an honorable mention, were experimental. And I think there's something to that. Again, small sampling, so you can't draw any hard and fast conclusions. But I've said all along that editors are just inundated with work, and really good work. There's a lot of really good creative writers out there, and they're producing work all the time, and so they send out to journals, and so editors are just kind of overwhelmed with really good stuff. And if a lot of stuff is rejected just simply because they can't publish everything they get. But I think you give yourself maybe more than a fighting chance of getting noticed and maybe having your piece picked out as opposed to potentially hundreds or thousands of others if it is a little bit different. If it plays with some of those elements that we've talked about, when you cut an editor or a contest judge who's literally reading hundreds of submissions and going through them one after another and so forth, they can all kind of start to blend together, quite honestly, and partly because they're all so darn good. So I think the pieces that visually stand out because the authors are playing with text, somehow playing with language or whatever it might be, that kind of gets them to perk up a little bit, and they might give it a more serious, more in-depth look than all those other pieces that are starting to kind of blend together. So that's another thought in terms of what do we want to do with our own writing? Will some experimentation help to stand out a little bit? Just my own personal experience. Again, not that I've won any major awards, but the novel that I've released in recent years that is by far the most experimental has also done the best. It's won a couple of awards. It got a starred review from Kirkus Reviews. It was Best Indie Book of 2017. And again, I point all that out not to brag, but to say that when I first wrote that novel and put it out into the world, it was so strange and so unusual. I thought, is anyone going to read this or get it or think it's worth anything? And in retrospect, looking back, it's actually done the best in terms of getting people's attention and winning some modest awards and that kind of thing. So I think there is room for experimentation and playfulness in contemporary publishing, and it's certainly something to think about, right? The other video I'm going to share with you from the last time I did this course is specifically on metaphor, and so I'm going to encourage you to take a look at that as well, because another topic that I thought about broaching in this video was just basically this idea that what makes any sort of work of literature successful or effective is the quality of the writing. Obviously, if we play with language, if we play with form, if we include graphic images, those can help a piece to kind of stand out and have a little bit different feel. But ultimately, if the writing itself isn't that great, not that poetic or not that, colorful in terms of imagery and those kinds of things, then I think the experimentation can come off as more of kind of a gimmick than a deliberate artistic choice. So anyway, the other video I'm going to share with you talks about metaphor and how to incorporate a successful metaphor into your writing and that kind of thing. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I'll be interested to hear what you might think about any of the thoughts I've shared with you or some of the examples I've shared with you. Thank you to the journals and the editors and the contest judges and the writers especially, whose work I highlighted a little bit in this video. And I definitely encourage you to subscribe to, buy copies of literary journals, because that's where the best writing is going on, and it always has been, quite frankly.